Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for the 18th of February for Thursday, where we are putting some closure to our short story unit by talking about two very short stories, Girl and Popular Mechanics. But I also wanted to backtrack a bit and talk a little bit about Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal a bit more. The last class, which if we had met in person would have been on Tuesday, was a snow day at GCC. Now, I had recorded that before I realized that we would be having a snow day. So, if you were able to see the video on Tuesday, that's lovely. But if not, I understand because it was a snow day. And I also gave an extension for the attendance question in light of that for that particular class. And the attendance question was about the three short stories, Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. Which did you dislike the most and why? And I wasn't too surprised that many of you had indicated Young Goodman Brown. If probably no other reason, the language, it's much more archaic than the other two pieces. And I had indicated that I wanted to give three short stories that were very different from one another in terms of their approach and their technique, just so we could get a little bit of a taste of different ways short story writers go about their craft. But one of the things I think you'll see that is true of all three of these short stories is that they have some level of contemporary relevance today. And with Young Goodman Brown, I wanted to draw your attention to a particular quote on page 328 that does a nice job of summarizing the point of that particular story. We talked about how Young Goodman Brown is an allegory, so therefore it works very much on a symbolic and representational level. But the quote reads, "There," resumed the sable form, "are all whom ye have reverenced from youth. Ye deem them holier than yourselves, and shrank from your own sin, contrasting it with their lives of righteousness and prayerful aspirations heavenwards. Yet here are they all in my worshiping assembly. This night it shall be granted you to know their secret deeds, how hoary bearded elders of the church have whispered wanton words to the young maids in their households. How many a woman, eager for widow's weeds, has given her husband a drink at bedtime and let him sleep his last sleep in her bosom. How beardless youths have made haste to inherit their father's wealth, and how fair damsels, blush not, sweet ones, have dug little graves in the garden and bidden me, the sole guest, to an infant's funeral. By the sympathy of your human hearts for sin, ye shall scent out all the places, whether in church, bedchamber, street, field, or forest, where crime has been committed, and shall exult to behold the whole earth one stain of guilt, one mighty blood spot." And we had talked a little bit about Puritanism in relation to this particular story and the very rigid religious belief that there was either pure good or pure evil. And this particular story exposes the idea that there is such a thing as pure good. And this quote in particular illustrates that. And if you're having difficulty with the language, I recommend that you read it out loud and then you try to paraphrase it and put it in your own contemporary words. So when we begin, there resume the sable form. In other words, the person who is dark. And we assume that the traveler, in one way or another, is some sort of supernatural entity. "Are all whom ye have reverenced from youth, you deem them holier than yourselves and shrank from your own sin." So these were all of the people that are admired because they're supposed to be the leaders of their community. And the assumption is that somehow they had more holiness than others, and they were not tainted by sin. And we see in this story that's not indeed the case. And that we'll know how hoary bearded elders of the church have whispered wanton words to the young maids of their households, how old men of the church have tried to seduce young virgins, how many a woman eager for widow's weeds has given her husband a drink at bedtime and let him sleep his last sleep in her bosom, how women have basically killed their husbands so they could achieve the position of a widow, how beardless youths have made haste to inherit their father's wealth, how young men basically have killed their fathers so that they could get the inheritance. And how fair damsels, blush not, sweet ones, have dug little graves in the garden, and bidden me, the sole guest, to an infant's funeral. That young virgins have basically killed their children and buried them in the garden rather than acknowledge that they gave birth out of wedlock. In other words, all of the dirty secrets that individuals have, this particular figure is exposing and illustrating that everyone has sin. And the assumption is so does Goodman. He never would have taken this journey if he himself was not in one way or another tempted. And at the ending of the story, we find out that Goodman died with no hopeful verse upon his tomb because he becomes a sad and dark and meditative man. And that's the lesson to us, is that we should not be destroyed when we lose our faith and when we see the truth of the hypocrisy and the sin surrounding us. For Soldier's Home, which is an easier piece to read just because of Hemingway's style and also because it was written in a more recent period, there's a quote that I wanted to read to you on page 164 that I think does a very nice job of illustrating how incredibly careful Hemingway happens to be with his details. And I had talked a little bit about how Hemingway would pare back his writing so that everything had a certain level of meaning to it. So he tried to be as concise as possible. And the scene on page 164 is he, and this is in reference to Krebs, sat there on the porch reading a book on the war. It was a history, and he was reading all about the engagements he'd been in. It was the most interesting reading he'd ever done. He wished there were more maps. He looked forward with a good feeling to reading all the really good histories when they would come out with good detailed maps. Now he was learning about the war. He had been a good soldier. That made a difference. And in that very brief description, it says so much about the situation that Krebs is in right now. First of all, he's on the porch. In other words, he's observing life. He's not living life. And he's reading a book about war. This is the way that he's going to learn about the war, and this is the way he's going to get validation about the war, by reading about it, because certainly he isn't going to experience it from his community. It also shows that he's not able to leave the war behind because he's still reading about it. So in many ways, he still is back in battle. He's reading a history, and he's reading about the engagements he had been in. And again, this is his only way to truly learn the broader picture outside of his own personal experiences of what happened and why it happened. And he says he's looking for maps, and he wished there'd been maps. And if you think about what a map does, a map offers direction. And this is what Krebs is looking for, direction. Basically, Krebs is lost. He looked forward with a good feeling to reading all the really good histories when they would come out with good detailed maps. That this is the only way he's going to make sense of what he experienced that seemed so senseless. Now he was really learning about the war. He'd been a good soldier. In other words, this is how he finds out that he had done well. And that made a difference. As we had discussed, he finds that he needs to lie, that no one truly understands him, that he's not really home. He's back in his old house, but he's not in a place where he's understood, which complicates the ending when he decides to leave. It could be the best thing possible because no one is ever going to understand him. Or it could be the worst thing possible because he basically is no longer attempting to try to reintegrate with his family, or a combination of the two. So that kind of ending is very typical in literature. We talked about how in Young Goodman Brown, we'll never know for certain whether or not Goodman experienced the events, or if they were some sort of a hallucination or a dream, or some kind of a psychological investigation into his desires and temptations. And the author doesn't want us to know, or else there would have been enough evidence to prove one or another. What's important is how Goodman changes as a result of his new knowledge, and how we aren't supposed to change in the same way. The same with Soldier's Home is that it's very much a reflection of our own reality, where sometimes things aren't good or bad, but they're mixed. And we don't know what happens to Krebs afterwards. We hope that he's able to move on and to lead a productive life, one in which he can acknowledge himself and have others acknowledge him as well. Though I would rather that an author not tell us and leave us to speculate than to give us an unsatisfying ending. And then finally, Battle Royal, and I had indicated that this piece reads very much like a short story, even though it's a novel, and that we're reading just a tiny piece of the novel. It's an incredibly important work in terms of African American studies and issues of race, and also gender, because we did see the naked blonde woman and how she was objectified and basically mistreated in the short section that we read. But the quote I wanted to highlight was on page 227, and that particular quote is in reference to the grandfather. The quote won't make complete sense until we read the novel as a whole, and obviously that's not going to happen. But I did want to talk about this quote and how we can understand it, at least in the context of what we've read thus far. And this is the grandfather. Remember, the date is 1947. And on his deathbed, the grandfather says, "After I'm gone," and this is 227, "after I'm gone, I want you to keep up the good fight. I never told you, but our life is a war, and I've been a traitor all my born days, a spy in the enemy's country, ever since I gave up my gun back in the Reconstruction. Live with your head in the lion's mouth. I want you to overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins, agree them to death and destruction. Let them swallow you till they vomit or burst wide open." And they thought the old man had gone out of his mind. He'd been the meekest of men. "Learn it to the youngings," he whispered fiercely, and then he died. So the Invisible Man doesn't first understand this, but as he experiences episode after episode, and we're introduced to the first episode with the Battle Royal, he understands exactly what his grandfather was telling him, that when he was saying to keep up the good fight, meaning in order to maintain dignity and honor, the African American community would have to continue to fight for respect and for equality. That's the good fight. But they had to do it in a way in which they protected themselves, because this was a very dangerous time period. So they couldn't do it overtly. They had to do that covertly, saying, "I never told you, but our life is a war. And this is a war that has to be played in a very delicate fashion. And that he's been a spy in the enemy's country. That the grandfather has basically pretended to be one thing to the enemy, the Caucasians in power in society. But he really has a completely different agenda. And he's been doing this ever since I gave up my gun back in the Reconstruction. The Reconstruction after the Civil War, where basically the African American community was supposed to accept the new status quo. Live with your head in the lion's mouth." And that, in other words, the African American community has to still keep themselves in danger by living in the lion's mouth being the Caucasian community. Despite the fact that slavery does not exist, that does not mean that prejudice and racism has stopped existing. And we see that very clearly with the Battle Royal. Now, this is a very dangerous time period. I want you to overcome them being the Caucasian community in power, overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins, agree them to death and destruction. In other words, pretend to be meek and compliant, but acknowledge deep down inside that that's not how you feel, and that you're looking for an opportunity in which you can object to the violence and object to the discrimination and the racism and the degradation and the horrors of society, and to try to change it. Let them swallow you till they vomit or burst wide open. In other words, you're going to continue to play this game of meekness until you're able to overthrow them. And they thought the old man had gone out of his mind. The family didn't understand. What the old man says is, learn it to the youngins. In other words, teach this to the next generation, which includes the Invisible Man, because we were talking about that this is a story of an adult looking back on his youth. And in his youth, when he's in the Battle Royal, he doesn't necessarily understand that he is not going to be given opportunity because of his ethnicity. He also doesn't understand that he is invisible, that he will be never seen as an individual because he's black. By the ending of the novel, he understands this very, very clearly. And of course, since this is him reflecting on his youth, what we get is the place that he would be at the ending of the novel when he introduces us to the idea that he's an invisible man, but he just didn't realize that in his youth. So the last two stories I wanted to give are two very, very short stories. One entitled Girl by Jamaica Kincaid in 1978. And this happens to be from Antigua. And most of the stories that we've been reading have been from Britain or the United States. So I thought that this would be a good story that would perhaps broaden our perspectives. And it's a mother who happens to be speaking to, or a mother figure at least, who happens to be speaking to a female child. And what we get are a list of rules and expectations for female in 1970s Antigua. That said, I think that those rules and expectations would have been rather similar in 1970s United States, and perhaps even on some level today. And we get emphasis on several elements of what is important in terms of being a girl. And many of the demands or the rules are about housekeeping and caretaking of family. But there also is the repetition of the slut you're so bent on becoming. In other words, the importance of female maintaining sexual purity in society for her to be able to achieve respect and status. Not just home taking or home caring and not just family caring, but also maintaining a sense of sexual purity. Now, the girl speaks twice, and we see this in italics. And the first time the girl speaks is she's saying, I don't sing Benna, which would be a kind of music that would be inappropriate to be sung in church, which the mother accuses her of doing. The mother never responds. The mother just continues on. And then finally, at the very ending, the girl asks, but what if the baker won't let me squeeze the bread? And then the mother's response is, you mean to say that you're going to be the kind of girl the baker won't let squeeze the bread? Now, if you think about all of the rules that the mother is giving the child, in some ways they seem to be very oppressive and repressive. But they also are somewhat surprising because the mother gives her some examples of how to rebel. How to spit in the air, for instance, which is not very ladylike, and not be hit by spit. Or how to make medicine to throw away a child before it becomes a child. In other words, to abort a child. If you think about it, that's the exact antithesis of the slut I know you're so bent on becoming. So not only does the mother give the girl the rules that are required for the girl to earn respect in society as a woman, in other words, how to teach a girl to become a woman, but the mother is also providing, albeit briefly, some suggestions about how to manipulate those rules and to be able to exert some level of power and authority within them. And when we get to, you mean to say that you're the kind of girl who the baker won't let near the bread. In other words, if you follow the rules of society, or perhaps more importantly, if you appear to follow the rules and expectations of society for female, this will allow you a certain level of power and access. The power and access is squeezing the bread, that the baker wouldn't let just anybody squeeze the bread. And I think it's an apt image as well because bread is oftentimes used for slang for money, and money is oftentimes associated with power. But how do you gain access in society? Well, you live with your head in the lion's mouth, as the grandfather said in Battle Royal. In other words, in some ways, it's rather similar in that you have to keep up the facade at least, and that will allow you to gain a certain level of respect. Now, one of the reasons why I've kept this piece is because of its writing style, because in many ways it deals with content that we've discussed further when we talked about Sorrowful Woman and Story of an Hour, about the roles and expectations of female and how limiting they were. But you may or may not notice that this piece is basically written with one long semicolon. And I've indicated where you can find this piece online as well as find it in our textbook, which is page 114, so that if it turns out that you are not able to access the textbook, I encourage you to look very carefully at the actual writing of the piece, because what we've got are sentence after sentence joined up with semicolon. And This is very deliberate because the semicolon is not a complete stop in the way that a period is. A semicolon is a very long pause. It's used to connect two independent clauses, or in other words, two complete sentences that are very closely related to one another, and you want to show the relationship. But basically, the semicolon does not allow us as reader to stop. And I think that's very important because these rules that come one after another in some ways are never ending. So the use of punctuation and defying the rules of how you should use punctuation. Because from a writer's perspective, when we're writing an academic paper, we should use periods to separate sentences. The semicolon is a piece of punctuation we use very, very rarely to show a very close relationship between two sentences. Or if we were to use it frequently, it would lose its power. That said, here it's obviously overused, so the author is breaking the rules, and I love the idea that the author is breaking the rules in the actual construction of the writing, or at least the assumed rules of how one should write, because with a short story or any piece of creative writing, you really can break all of the conventions of writing that we've become accustomed to when we're writing an academic paper, let's say. And that semicolon emphasizes the overwhelming nature of all of these tasks that the girl has to work with. In some ways, this piece reads almost like a poem rather than a short story. If it were to be organized in a different way, rather than from one end of the page to the other, if we were to have staggered lines, we'd have something that would be very similar to basically a poem. So this piece also shows how genres can sometimes not necessarily be strictly one or another, that sometimes they can bleed over a little bit into others. Though it is a short story in the way that it was written. And when we think about girl and breaking conventions, so does Popular Mechanics. That too breaks conventions, and I've included a website for Popular Mechanics if you don't have your book. But on page 276 is where you can find the book. And again, you have to look very, very carefully to see the way the piece was constructed. So if you didn't notice, I encourage you to go back and see that Popular Mechanics, even though it's mostly dialogue, has no quotation marks. And we know that that also is a convention of writing, and that you are supposed to use quotation marks when someone is speaking. However, when you're not using the quotation marks, you are again defying convention and expectation. And you also are perhaps suggesting that this isn't necessarily dialogue that's limited to a particular individual, but this is something that's much more universal. And I think we see both of that with Girl and Popular Mechanics in the sense that we don't get character names in either piece. And we were told before about how this oftentimes works in literature with A Sorrowful Woman, in that that tends to universalize and generalize the experience beyond one particular person. So this is a girl in the story Girl listening to a mother figure. In other words, this is how mothers indoctrinate or educate their female children. And what an interesting story it would have been if we had heard a story called Boy, where a mother was talking to a boy or a father figure was talking to a boy. But we've got a story by Jamaica Kincaid, and obviously she wants us to focus on the idea of female. In this particular story, Popular Mechanics, we're supposed to focus on a couple who perhaps are having an argument that has been had many times in many living rooms across America, emphasized not only by the fact that there are no quotation marks, but also that basically it begins with one partner telling the other that they're glad they're leaving. There's a little bit of profanity. Then they begin to argue over first a picture of their baby, an object. Of course, you can't rip up a picture in two because you ruined the picture. And of course, that's a little bit of foreshadowing of what's going to be happening with the story because they both want the child. And the setting tells us early that day, the weather turned and the snow was melting into dirty water. So already we've got a negative setting here. Things are going to get dirty in this story. And streaks of it ran down from the little shoulder-high window that faced the backyard. And we know that windows can represent growth and opportunity, but not in this particular instance. Here we've got a tiny window, it's shoulder length, it's facing the backyard. It's the exact opposite of Mrs. Mallard's window. And we're told it's getting dark, but it's getting dark on the inside too. And as they continue to argue back and forth, we don't know the reason for their argument, and we're not supposed to. We're not supposed to take sides with this. They're both equally to blame in the fact that ultimately what's most important is the welfare of the child, which both of them neglect as they continue to argue back and forth, treating the child as if it's a possession or a piece of property in which they can exert power over the other. And things get worse as they end up in the kitchen, which is usually a room that is associated with family, and it is usually associated with safety. But they're in a corner behind the stove holding the child. In other words, a very dangerous place. And at this point, the baby is red-faced and screaming. Obviously, this child is in distress. And rather than acknowledge the child, they continue to argue. And they actually knocked down a flower pot that was hanging behind the stove. Again, some more foreshadowing. They've killed something or destroyed something that's alive, the flower pot. And they'll be doing something similar very soon. And they both accuse the other of hurting the baby, but the reality is that they're both hurting the baby. And the kitchen window is giving no light. They're both pulling as far and as hard as they can. And then the ending, which is not very clear, in the sense that it almost reminds me like A Rose for Emily. There's a certain level of subtlety to it. He would not let go. He felt the baby slipping out of his hands, and he pulled back very hard. And remember, she would not let go either. And in this manner, the issue was decided. So what does this mean, that the issue was decided? I know what we want. We as readers want that one or another parent ended up with the child. That's not what happened. If both parents pull as hard as they can on a delicate infant, they basically tear that child in two. And this is a takeoff of the biblical story of Solomon, if you're familiar with that story. Oftentimes pieces of literature will reference earlier pieces of literature, and the Bible itself has oftentimes been read as a piece of literature. And the story of Solomon is the story of a king who's approached by two women who claim to be the birth mother of a child. Solomon tries to get them to reach some sort of a compromise or agreement, and they refuse. So Solomon basically rules that each mother can have half of the child, and he will cut the child in half. And one of the women steps forward and says, no, let the other woman have the child, because I don't want the child to be hurt. And Solomon says, well, then you must be the birth mother, because only a birth mother would be willing to sacrifice herself for the well-being of her child. And that's the lesson there, that you put your child's welfare above your own. This story, which was written in 1981, which is when divorce was becoming quite popular at the time. I say that deliberately because of the title, which I'll get back to in a moment. This story shows how neither parent is willing to put the welfare of the child above their own welfare, and they literally destroy that child. And hopefully this is something that's just fiction, but if you think about what happens psychologically to children, how they oftentimes are pulled emotionally with each parent and split into two, you can see how this piece, Popular Mechanics, has a certain level of relevance. And popular in that it happens frequently, or is beginning to happen frequently. And mechanics, and one of the definitions of mechanics, it happens to be two forces that are working against one another, which works very nicely here. There also is a magazine by the title of Popular Mechanics. It's one of those do-it-yourself magazines that shows how to build things and fix things. And again, we could say this story almost serves like an instruction manual about how to break things, how to break a child. So these two pieces are very short, but they have an incredible amount of elements within them in which we can examine some of the societal statements and the personal statements of the authors themselves. The original title for the piece, Popular Mechanics, was mine. And you can learn that with the questions at the back of the story, because the question number 5 on page 278 tells you, discuss the title of the story. The original title was Mine. Which do you think is more effective, Mine or Popular Mechanics? Mine is obviously more clear cut. But many of the elements that I've talked about with all of the short stories are things that the questions at the ending of the stories have asked you to consider. And those are ways that you too can approach these particular pieces. Now that we've put some closure onto our short story unit, there will be a journal due. Now, I gave an extension for the journal because I've fallen a little bit behind. Today was scheduled as catch-up class, and I used it in just that way. I've caught up. So now we're back to where the syllabus says we should be. And ideally, we would have had a journal due today, but I gave an extension for it until Tuesday, the 23rd. Though certainly you can hand in your journal at any point. And what I'm asking is that you send me a PDF to my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. By the 23rd, 11:59 p.m. If you can't make it by that particular point in time, just ask me for an extension. Approximately a page or so response to a short story, and I'm asking you to choose 3 short stories, so you would end up responding for about a page or so for each short story that you choose out of the 3. So in other words, you'd probably end up having a 3-page journal, 1 page devoted to one short story, 1 page to another short story, and the last page to a 3rd short story. You get to choose the short stories from the short story unit. Certainly you can write more than a page or less than a page. That's just a guesstimate. I am going to review it for content, not for grammar or mechanics, and grade it informally on a checkmark system and return it back to you. But I'm hopeful that this will give you a way to interact a little bit more with the short stories and perhaps give you some ideas on how to proceed with the paper, which is where we're going to end up next class. I wanted to talk a little bit about writing academic papers, and I also wanted to begin to transition us into our next unit, which happens to be drama. For today's attendance question, though, and that'll be due Friday the 19th at 10 a.m. Again, if you can't make that time, just ask me for an extension. I'll be happy to give it to you. I'm going to ask you to look up biographical information about either Jamaica Kincaid, and she is the author of Girl, or Raymond Carver, and he is the author of Popular Mechanics. So to go online or use another resource and see if you can find some information about their lives, some biographical information, and briefly indicate in your response to the attendance question how that information could be used to understand the author's writing. And of course, we talked about that an author's biography can be very useful because it can sometimes give us a lens into understanding what they wrote and why they wrote it. Ernest Hemingway is a good example with Soldier's Home because Ernest Hemingway himself had experiences with war and difficulty reintegrating back into society, much like Krebs did. But we also have to be cautious because just because a author has a particular biographical element, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are examining it in their particular text. After all, their texts are fiction. But I thought it would be useful for you to find out a little bit more about either Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver. And I know probably your first go-to response will be to go on Google or perhaps Wikipedia. I'm not averse to either one of those. I use both those resources myself. But understand that they are not as trustworthy as some of other resources that you might find that are affiliated with schools or libraries, much like our own library. I'm sure you've probably heard about our library databases, which are electronic resources that can be accessed only through our library site. But the advantage of those resources is that they've been vetted, they've been reviewed in order to test for a certain level of accuracy in the way that websites on the open web are not. And it's the reason why these resources through the library need to be purchased by the library. And it's why individuals like ourselves usually don't have access to them unless we're affiliated with something like an academic institution, which we all are, GCC. And the easiest way to go about doing this is just to have a library card if you don't already have one, because that'll give you a code that will allow you to access all of the library resources. And I tell you this because there are actually several databases on our library website that are devoted to biographies. So you could easily use one of those databases to look up information about Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver. But again, not required to. I leave it up to your discretion. Just understand if you're using the wide open net, you want to be a little bit more cautious than perhaps you would be if you were using a library resource. But I'm very eager to see what it is you find out about Jamaica Kincaid and Raymond Carver. And again, I encourage all of you to read all of the responses from your classmates because that's the best way that you're going to get a thorough a kind of thorough review of both of these particular authors, since I suspect many of you will choose many different elements from their lives. So this is a quick and dirty way, so to speak, for you to find out a good amount about Jamaica Kincaid and Raymond Carver. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we will continue on by talking a little bit about writing papers about literature and also introducing the idea of drama. Take care. Bye bye.